Welcome to Expats Everywhere. Can you tell us your name, where you're from, and a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Natalie. I am from Florida and Georgia in the States, and I just recently got out of the Peace Corps in Guatemala.
All right, so what was it like being in the Peace Corps in Guatemala?
Yeah, I was there for 2 years and 6.5, 7 months, and I had such a wonderful experience. Such a wonderful experience in Guatemala. My experience was almost entirely made by my host family. I lived with three indigenous women who speak Mayan language. So I was learning Spanish and I was learning the Mayan language called Quiche at the same time. So when I got to country, my Spanish level was intermediate mid, according to a test that Peace Corps does through their language teachers. They called me so that they could determine what my level was before I got to country, so that they knew coming in how much Spanish I could speak. So once I got to site, I was intermediate high after like 9 weeks of training and during what's called PST or pre-service training. And then I started learning Quiche in my site while I was still definitely working on my Spanish. So it was like a rich cultural experience, but it was also a rich linguistic experience.
What made you want to go into the Peace Corps?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I jokingly, but not so jokingly say that it's because I needed healthcare. And I told a lot of folks that, like, okay, I wanted to live abroad. I wanted to really be a part of a community. How do I do that and be insured? And Peace Corps quickly floated to the top of the list because I was over 26, so I knew that I couldn't be on my parents' insurance. And so that was kind of what sparked the interest. And then I looked on Peace Corps' website, and for anyone who's interested in going into the Peace Corps, that's the place to start because, they're hiring people from all different parts of the country. You're not really going to have an in-person interview to be in Peace Corps. So you can apply and go through the interview process, the application process remotely, even if you are a U.S. citizen and you're somewhere else in the world. I think there's a couple of, you might have to get like a federal background check that does require fingerprints. But other than that, I interviewed with Peace Corps on Skype when I was in Germany.
Okay, do you have to be American or a certain nationality to be in the Peace Corps?
You do have to have your U.S. citizenship. You don't have to have been born in the States, but you do have to have your citizenship. And I do believe, I'm almost certain that having your bachelor's degree is a prerequisite.
Okay, so after you have your interview, whether it's on Skype or whatever it might be, what's the process once they approve you?
So what you do when you send in your application before you even speak to anyone, you can either pick 3 countries that you're interested in living or working, or you can pick 3 projects. Now, that includes any project or anywhere. So, for example, you pick 3 pairings. So I could pick, for my first preference, I could pick Guatemala as my country preference, but under project, I could pick any project. Does that make sense? So in that sense, it would be Guatemala making the determination for me rather than the project. Now, when I say project, I just mean the job, the work that you'll be doing. The second pairing, it could be, I want to work with youth. So my project preference is youth and development, but send me anywhere. So you could group it like that. Or you could say, I want to be in Mongolia and I want to work with youth. So the country and the project. And that's how they go through the application process, is working with those 3 different preferences that you've specified. So how I did it was I listed Guatemala and youth. I knew that I wanted to be in a Spanish-speaking country and I knew I wanted to work with youth. So Guatemala was the only thing at the time that was Spanish, the only country at the time that was Spanish-speaking that also had a youth project in the cycle in which, I guess, in their interview cycle at the time that I applied.
Okay, so how likely is it that you get what you want?
Now, I definitely don't have an answer to that. I think that there are more popular posts or countries to go to and less popular. Now, I will tell you that I think in 2015, it was either 2015 or 2014, Peace Corps changed their whole system. It used to be that you put in a generic application and they placed you in a country in a project.
Okay.
You had absolutely no say. So my friend who served from 2014 to 2016, or maybe 2015 to 2017, she was in Mongolia. And she did not choose Mongolia. Like, she got assigned there and went there. So now with this new system, I think you have a good chance of either getting the project you want or the country. The chance of you getting both might be less likely, but it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on how popular of a post it is, etc.
Yeah, but you were able to get yours, what you wanted.
I was, but I will tell you that Peace Corps is so different depending on the post. My experience in Guatemala was unique to Peace Corps Guatemala. So, for example, right now I'm in a graduate program where I'm working with other RPCVs. Peace Corps loves acronyms, so just know that. It's a government-based organization, so everything is acronyms. But RPCV means Returned Peace Corps Volunteer. It means you finished your 2 years. So I know other RPCVs, and they both served in Africa. Their two experiences are very unique compared to one another, even being in the same continent. My experience being in Guatemala is a totally different element as well. So a long way to answer your question, but the bottom line is that Guatemala is not an especially popular post because the rules and regulations are especially strict for us as Peace Corps volunteers. We can't travel after 6 p.m. There are a lot of travel routes that we can't take on public transportation. We had to only use the Peace Corps shuttle from point A to point wherever. And we were restricted from going to a lot of areas where, say, you would want to go get a beer at 5 p.m. on a Wednesday, whereas where you're going to be posted, where you're going to be placed, there's not going to be the kind of culture that you might be used to and looking for.
Okay. And is that for safety reasons that they do that?
Yes. Yeah. So because it's a government organization, they're always going to be anxious about your safety because it looks really bad on them if something happens to you. It's for safety reasons. And I think that that's probably based on the relationship the U.S. Department of Defense has with that country and what their statistics show on safety.
Okay, so while we're talking about safety, how safe did you feel in Guatemala?
It's a great question. I felt so safe to the point that I feel more comfortable in my own skin now in the States, going out and doing things like running after 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. or things like that, because I really generally think people aren't out to get me. But I also was very restricted in where I could go. So in my pueblo or my village where I was, there was no problem. I mean, I never had an issue. I will say that as in most countries, drinking is part of the culture, but public intoxication is not illegal in Guatemala. So you deal with the term you use is bolo. It just means street drunk. So I would sometimes run into folks who wanted to share their English with me. That tends to come out more when they're drinking. But it was never threatening or disconcerting. And even that was pretty mild, all things considered.
Okay, great. So let's shift a little bit and talk about what did a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, so my project was working with youth. I mentioned my host family. I lived with 3 women, and I cooked breakfast for myself upstairs in my apartment. I had my own private space, my own bathroom, bedroom, and living area. In fact, I had so much more space than I have here. So that I actually feel like, I don't think that's the typical experience, but I felt like I had it really cush in Peace Corps. But I did breakfast alone, and then would make lunch and dinner with my host family downstairs, and they had a wood-burning stove. So no refrigerator, we had running water. We had running water every day. I had a heater above my running water in my shower. So I actually, all things considered, I was very comfortable. I did have to boil my water so that they don't put chlorine or treat their water in the public water system. So you have to be careful of that. If you go to Guatemala, only drink bottled water. Brush your teeth with bottled water. Do not eat street food. Your body is not used to the, in Spanish, it's microbios, like the different bacteria that are in the food and water. But for work, I taught in the afternoons. Now in the mornings, depending on what was going on, I was either working on preparing projects, lesson planning, or I was meeting up with folks who I was collaborating with in different projects. But usually in the morning, I had a lot of flexibility. In the afternoons, so I'd eat lunch with my host family, and then I would walk to school. One of my schools was 50 minutes walking from my house, and the other one was 15. So I could have taken transit in the little rickshaws that came over from India, are fairly new in Guatemala, but they're great for the villages because you need to get around, and it's really cheap. So I could either take a tuk-tuk to my my village that was further out, but I would usually just walk to get the exercise. And middle school and high school is from 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. They have recess around 3:30, and I would work with teachers on mostly the second year, especially mostly sexual health education and drugs and alcohol education.
Okay, interesting. So before you got into this normal routine, did Peace Corps train you?
Okay, when you get to country, as of my experience, so just know that this can change over the years, but I trained in 2016. They sent all of the volunteers who were going to Guatemala to Houston. So we had one night together in Houston in a hotel, and we had training during that evening, afternoon. Of course, they pay for your flight from wherever you live to Houston. And then the next morning we got up way earlier than we needed to, all went to the airport together and left on the same plane and arrived to Guatemala. We were picked up from the airport by Peace Corps Guatemala staff and taken directly to the office. And then we were in training for 2 months, or 10 weeks is about what it comes out to. During that time, we lived with a host family, but it was a temporary host family. It was not our host family that we had during service.
Do they give you a requirement on how many bags you can bring with you?
Yeah, definitely. You can bring 2 50-pound bags. Yeah.
Good. And then earlier you mentioned you had insurance, but what about money? How much money did you make while there?
So you get paid a per diem or stipend, a living stipend while you're in Peace Corps. There are a couple of really great perks around doing Peace Corps financially, because you also accrue what is called a readjustment allowance. So it's like you get a nugget at the end of your 2 years, and that accrues monthly. So say you only do Peace Corps for 7 months, you're going to get 7 months worth of what you would have made had you finished the 2 years. It's not like an all or nothing thing. But that amounts to, they do it the best way possible, so you get taxed the least. I don't know how all that comes out, but when you finish service, you get a chunk of, it's about $8,000 or $9,000, depending on if you extend, or if you leave early, it's obviously going to be less, but that'll help you get back to the States. And that's why they call it a readjustment allowance. In terms of living expenses while you're in the country, they set rent for you. Like, they have a representative who goes and determines how much you'll be paying for monthly rent, because you don't know, like, you can't determine that number for yourself. And they deposit into your account your rent plus 250 USD, which to me was around 3,600 quetzales, which is the currency in Guatemala. I heard volunteers all the time say, oh, it's the end of the month, I don't have any money, but like, I never ran into that problem. I was actually able to save so much so that I traveled around Guatemala after my service and did not even touch my readjustment in US dollars. I had saved up quetzales from my monthly stipend and was traveling very comfortably and didn't run out. you don't make anything in taxes in your 2 years in Peace Corps. So you're not going to like file and get a tax return. It'll be $0 because you're living out of the country. So that's something to consider.
Okay, so you mentioned you heard other people in the Peace Corps talking about things. So did you see other people in the Peace Corps on a daily basis, or did you hang out with them?
Yeah, that's a great question that you should definitely keep in mind is totally dependent on the post. I lived in Guatemala, so my experience was that I had site mates. I shared, Santa Clara was the name of my pueblo. I lived alone with my host family, but there were other volunteers who lived in the same vicinity. So I could see them every day if I wanted to. The next volunteer closest by would be like less than an hour away. Now, Guatemala, for safety reasons, has a very small region around where they can send volunteers. So in other countries, like in the Gambia, I talked to a RPCV, Returned Peace Corps volunteer, who lived 4 hours from her banking town. Oh. So in order to get paid, we would use debit cards to get our monthly stipend. They would deposit it into our account. So she would have to go the 4 hours to get to the bank. Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of it really is just dependent on what country you end up in.
Absolutely. And, they, depending on the post, depending on the country, your PM as your project manager, they're essentially responsible for your fate. They're going to take into account your preferences as much as possible, assuming that you have a good PM. For me, I was like, I do not want to be in a cloudy, rainy site. That's not good for my mental health. I need to be in a sunny place. So I made sure to tell her that, and she took that into consideration. Now, as in terms of like pulling out a map and me being like, I would like to live here. No, that's not going to happen. Nor do you want it to. You definitely want your project manager to pair what she knows about you learned over the 9-10 weeks of training with where she or he thinks you'll be in your best site based on the work partners that she knows in those sites.
Okay, great. So lastly, is there any advice you would give to someone who's interested in going into the Peace Corps?
Do it. Do Peace Corps. I wouldn't trade even my hardest day for the best day in the States. It's changed my perspective on so much. It's changed my perspective on what it means to be a U.S. citizen. It's changed my perspective on what global citizenship looks like. I understand now very tangibly what the word developing country means. And I feel like I've become more sensitive to terminology around developing countries. Like, I don't use the term third world country because it makes it sound like it's behind a first world country. So I use developing and developed, or industrialized and developing. And I was so loved by my pueblo in spite of the potential tension that could exist because of the history between the U.S. and Guatemala, but it was never like that. It was just, people invited me over for lunch that I never really knew. They'd see me in the market and say, "What are you doing now? Why don't you come to lunch?" And now I'm studying to be a Spanish teacher. So had I not done Peace Corps, I would not have this professional opportunity. I will also say that there are scholarships provided to RPCVs once you finish, and participating universities will give you a stipend or will help pay a portion of your scholarship simply for you being a returned Peace Corps volunteer.
All right. Awesome. Natalie, thanks so much for telling us about the Peace Corps today.
Absolutely.